It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you this evening to talk about this very exciting confluence of two types of trends, each with tremendous potential. The rise of simulation models, particularly highly articulated models that can really inform detailed policy design on the one hand, and the growth and the availability of large-scale data sets, both administrative data, mentioned by the previous speakers, as well as a whole raft of electronically sourced data that we're just starting to tap into. I'd like to begin my talk, however, with my most sincere acknowledgments to many people. The first are the traditional owners of this land. I'd also like to provide the most sincere thanks to those in the team from the Sax and the APPC who helped arrange this occasion and followed it through many room changes and shifts in plans. And I want to thank Dr. Jeff McDonnell for his facilitation of all of this work, which has been so important for making all of these collaborations possible. It's been my real delight and again privilege to be able to collaborate with the Sax Institute and the APPC on a growing number of different projects and programs. And I think there's a very exciting future ahead of us for application of some of the techniques that I'll be talking about tonight. So I'd like to just note that within this presentation, while I've adhered to the title that was picked out, I have a separate subtitle, and that's Moving Beyond Myth and Madness. And this refers to a quote from epidemiologist Phil Zuckerman, as communicated to me by mathematical epidemiologist Mark Orr, which basically says that theory without data is myth, and data without theory is madness. And I'm going to be talking today about how I can believe we can leverage the power of combining dynamic modeling on the one hand and big data on the other to transcend both myth and madness, to arrive at policy-relevant recommendations that are grounded by tremendous amounts of empirical evidence, but allow us to reliably ask about counterfactual situations. So within the talk, I'm going to begin by a discussion of a bit of motivation for this work. Many of those in the audience will no doubt share my interest in these fields, but each of us comes to it with a somewhat different perspective and a different set of priorities. So I'll be talking a little bit about the health policy challenges that for me so centrally motivate this work, and particularly the notion of complex systems, which provides such a key motivation for the use of dynamic modeling. I'll then go on to describe what I mean by big data, which is a term that's been hyped to no end and has been often overused in very different ways. So I'll be characterizing some features of what I believe the term can fruitfully be used for. And then I'll be providing a bit of a vignette. I'm someone who may talk in abstract words, but feels uncomfortable dwelling purely on them. I like concrete understanding. And so I'll be providing a concrete case of bringing together simulation modeling and big data to inform understanding relevant to health policy. And I'll be hitting on several topics there to give a flavor of, at a concrete level, how do these techniques come together? And then I'll conclude with some general remarks. So from my perspective, the motivation for this confluence lies in the fact that we're confronting as a society, indeed as a world, ever more complex health policy challenges. And these challenges are of many different sorts. Some of them involve syndemics of mutually interacting conditions. The work that I do with Dr. Roland Dick here, an eminent epidemiologist of diabetes within Canada, has focused on the syndemic involving gestational diabetes and type 2 diabetes and its ripple-through effects with kidney disease. In other cases, we have interactions of conditions such as TB with behavioral risk factors such as smoking and the set of morbidities associated with them, and with diabetes. We have distressing mental health gaps, and much of the work in suicide that was noted earlier is really spent because of this. These mental health gaps are yawning despite a lot of work that's tried to lessen the burden within vulnerable groups. And we're increasingly aware of the profound life course impacts of early life insults and indeed of social determinants of health in shaping inequities in society, where early life experiences, perhaps in utero or in the first few years of life, can set oneself on a trajectory that disadvantages one in terms of many chronic disease as well as other outcomes. And we're also aware that in the smaller and smaller world we live in, given intercontinental travel, there's a wide raft of emerging infectious diseases, SARS, swine flu, MERS, et cetera, that increasingly trouble our public health systems. And we see ever more nimble corporate actors in the food sector and the tobacco sector who are running circles around public health authorities by tapping into social networking, by tapping into the latest electronic technologies, and thereby evading some tobacco-related interventions, for example, which have long been a staple of anti-tobacco efforts. Now, much of what makes these challenges so difficult is that they have to do with complex systems where, as we say, the whole is different than the sum of the parts. Just like a traffic jam can't merely be reduced to the mechanical properties of the cars within it, so it is that many of these challenges cannot simply be reduced to individual components. So we can study a tremendous amount about the metabolics associated with obesity, but still have little clue about how to function in a world where we have multiple levels of context. We can understand in detail how nicotine plays a role in driving addiction, but we can still run afoul of policy resistance when trying to put in place anti-tobacco interventions that end up triggering harm rather than good, such as the anti-tar interventions focused on introducing low-tar cigarettes in the States in the 70s. When we're dealing with these complex systems, we need to understand more than the pieces. We need to understand their interconnections. We need to understand emergence, how the behavior of the whole comes out of these interconnected parts. And that requires a different set of skills than understanding the parts. The understanding the parts is still critical, but what's needed is a science of the whole, and that's often called complexity science or system science. The reason this is so urgently needed, the reason that it's more than an intellectual endeavor, is because it's critical to understand how the system behaves in response to counterfactuals, to undertake reliable interventions, to undertake policy regimes that will yield cost-effective and long-term effective gains, to put in place, as Jeff says, fixes that stay fixed. And to explain what's observed, as we've noted in some of our contributions, whether a given trend in incidence is a sign of something that's a crisis, or whether indeed it's a good sign that our surveillance systems are working more effectively, often requires a very detailed understanding of how the system works. And to capture this detailed understanding in an operational way, to be able to interrogate it and test it and to ask questions that are about counterfactuals, we turn to these things called simulation models. These models allow us to capture operational theory, as it were, about how things might be behaving out there in the world. And we do that not because that theory is guaranteed to be correct, but precisely because it is not guaranteed to be correct. By building these models, we can more quickly test our understanding against empirical evidence. And having gone through the process of refining that model, we can then use it to ask about counterfactuals. And we build, in our work, models of many types, but with a particular focus on individual-based models, often known as agent-based models, and hybrid models, models that build together components drawn from system dynamics, from agent-based modeling, discrete event modeling, and other traditions. And building these models is often an exercise in theory building. And what's of note here for the rest of the talk is that often our theories these days, whether we're focused on ostensibly clinical issues such as occurrence of gestational diabetes and its management, or whether we're dealing solidly with social determinants of health as the focus of our model, these models often include fundamental need to represent aspects of human behavior, to reason about, even if it's biomedical, the level of adherence a patient will maintain, whether they present for care, for regular appointments and taking their ARVs for HIV. And needless to say, if we're dealing with behavioral risk factors or factors upstream, human behavior is often central to these needs. So we want to build models that help us as thinking tools to think through the implications of our actions, to think through, to test our theories, test them against observed empirical data so that we can refine our theories, to advance our understanding, and to question, once we've arrived at some confidence that our theory is at least consistent with empirical data, to ask questions about counterfactual situations. These are causal models. They're models that try to capture posited causal structure of a system so that we can reason through its implications for policy regimes. And in this context, we're often interested because the models allow us to think through the impacts of our interventions along multiple causal pathways, not just one. An example would be this work that relates to work we did with Jeannie Brooks-Gunn and her team at Columbia University, who are experts in housing interventions, housing voucher interventions in the States. And there's long been a note that these interventions have somewhat mixed effects. The large-scale Moving to Opportunity program, which allowed individuals to move from low-income neighborhoods to mixed-income neighborhoods, secured some impressive results. For teenage girls, obesity levels were lowered. Risk of criminal involvement was also lowered, arrest rates and other signs of criminal involvement. And there were higher rates of high school graduation that were secured within this group. But in order to interpret those findings, those aggregate findings, there was a lot of speculation about what might have been involved, what might have driven those. So some researchers, for example, pointed to greater neighborhood walkability, that these girls had a sense of greater ability to get around because there were sidewalks in place instead of just streets without those amenities. Or others pointed to perceived safety, that the girls could go out at all hours of the day with some confidence of personal safety. Others pointed to recreational space as causes for greater moderate to vigorous physical activity and thereby lowered obesity. Yet other researchers, however, questioned that and pointed, for example, to the availability of healthy foods in these new neighborhoods. Maybe it wasn't predominantly driven by physical activity, but these gains in obesity perhaps were secured through the greater availability of good food stores with fresh fruits and vegetables rather than the convenience stores that dotted their own neighborhoods. So they postulated a mediating factor of healthiness of diet. Others yet posited that really what was going on is that these girls, uprooted from their social networks, placed into new neighborhoods, spent more time at home. And they ate good home cooking rather than spending time in fast food restaurants. They had less risk of criminal involvement because they were spending more time with family rather than with schoolmates. And they spent more time at home under parental observation and therefore had better academic scores. The challenge here is that many of these hypotheses involved factors that we know are notoriously difficult to secure through self-report reliably. Since the NHANES 3 studies in the States, we've known that self-reporting of physical activity is often dramatically off from what's recorded by physical measures, things like accelerometers, heart rate measurements. We know that people's reporting of what they eat, their nutritional intake, and even their weight is often systematically off from what's captured when physical measures are used to direct observation. And when it comes to factors like where people are circulating, where they spend their time, their mobility patterns, when it comes to their social context, who they're spending time around, our work has demonstrated gaping differences between self-report and what's actually physically measured. And if we're interested in understanding those effects on individuals, the effects of norm spreading, for example, through social networks, or for that matter, physical proximity transmitting, leading to routes of transmission of airborne infections, these things matter. These things matter of how people are spending the time, the behaviors. And we often have little data on that to ground our models, to ground our understanding. Many researchers are interested in exposures to environments, to built environments, be they indoors or outdoors, exposure to adverse air quality as perhaps a risk factor for asthma in children, et cetera. And here too, again, our ability to capture with traditional instruments some of the location-based risk factors is limited. And the relevant realization here is that absent an understanding of these behaviors and these exposures, the potential for models to quantitatively evaluate policy trade-offs is compromised, is limited. It's not eliminated, but it limits our ability to give nearly the degree of confidence and strength of recommendation on the policy sphere that we'd like to. Now, the thesis of this presentation, indeed the thesis of much of our research program in this area, is that the advent of big data in health, something I'll be working to define in the next few minutes, will fundamentally enable and in fact synergize with dynamic modeling in a way that will allow us to build these models that are more reliable, more responsive to the policy regimes. So just to give some sense of big data, the term is used in many, many different ways. I'm using the term to refer to features which particularly focus on electronically available data with certain characteristics I'll get to on my next slide. Just to give you some concrete examples, these include social media feeds, things like Twitter feeds, Facebook status updates, data from environmental sensors, lab test results available electronically, and some administrative data and large amounts, such as with the 45 and up study that is run out of Sax. But it also includes a variety of novel types of data sources, such as from consumer electronic devices, the Fitbits, the Jawbones, the Samsung watches and Apple watches of the world, but also from devices as prosaic as this, the tablets and the smartphones we carry around. It includes aspects of health information browsing behavior and the types of data that are picked up by modern buildings on the internal environment, and the data on that we can pick up from communicational infrastructure that clues us in to where we are in the environments to which we're exposed. What is it that links these data sources? Well, I haven't found yet a better definition than what Google came up with what they termed the 4 V's. And these have particular meaning and significance in the health context. The first of them, the one that attracts the attention, the one that's lent it its name, is volume. We have lots of data. The data fills up gigabytes and terabytes on our hard drives when we come to store it, rather than the megabytes of a traditional, that might be associated with a traditional EPI data set. But in my mind, that's perhaps the least important of these 4 V's in the health area. The other 3, I think, have even more weight. One is its high velocity. What I mean by that is its fine temporal resolution. Every second, it's estimated something like 5,000 tweets come in worldwide. The data that's picked up by accelerometers in a 5-minute period by my smartphone runs into tens of thousands of records often. We have data from GPS updating every few minutes, which tracks my location. Compared to the, every 30-day surveys or surveys once annually, this is very high velocity data. And that really matters for dynamic modeling, as it turns out. It's also high variety data. So simultaneously, a device like this will pick up cross-linked data on accelerometry, on my location through Wi-Fi and GPS locationing. It'll pick up my proximity to others through Bluetooth. It will pick up my responses to survey questions on the device, my browsing behavior using certain keywords. In short, it can pick up a bunch of data that individually is interesting, but it's cross-linking that's of greatest interest. The fact that we can triangulate from it about what's going on, what a person's environment is. And finally, and not to be missed, is veracity. This notion of big data is often misunderstood as meaning that every bit of big data is more accurate in its measurements, more accurate what it tells you about the world. And that's not always the case. Big data can include lots of imprecise measurement. It's more that collectively it gives us certain types of information that are very precise. And we can put two and two together because of variety and arrive at a very confident understanding. But even so, there are particular physical measures that are much more reliable. Let's pick dietary intake. If we have people take photos of their foods, we're getting a level of understanding that transcends simple self-report, particularly at a distal point like once every 30 days. If we're dealing with measuring blood sugar levels, doing an automatic recording of it through Bluetooth of the measurement, or taking a photo even on an older style Bluetooth, older style blood glucose meter, can clue you in with greater confidence to what that reading is on the blood glucose meter. If we are trying to measure physical activity, we can pick up a lot with accelerometers and heart rates. So at the level of measurement, we can often get more precise measurements, ones that are subject less to recall bias, to reporting bias, and other factors that bedevil much self-report data. So I'd like to give you a concrete sense of this, and to do this, I'm going to feature a system that we make central use of. It came out of our lab, spun out of our lab, and it's known as the Ethicai Epi system. It runs on Android, and shortly there's a release for iPhone. And it runs on participant smartphones, and we'll be featuring this in the vignette. It undergoes bursty data collection, so every few minutes it's collecting data, and it batches it up until an opportunistic opportunity arrives for it to upload data to servers in an encrypted form. So it's stored in a secured fashion on the device, and then catch can, it will upload bits of data as a person circulates in conjunction with data transmission networks of various sorts. It can record diverse sensor modalities, but maybe more importantly yet, it can trigger surveys based on context, where you are, with whom you are, how long you've been there, whether you're in a park or you're near a fast food restaurant. And it can allow individuals to volunteer information in kind of a crowdsourcing sort of way. When they see something of note for a given study, they can report it. And it has a bunch of modules to link it in with smartwatches, social media scales, weight scales, et cetera. And it's been applied in many, many studies. A foremost goal of this has been security and providing the option for ethical reasons of allowing person to opt out at any point of continuing to record data, to snooze the device, to uninstall it. And it has a very, very secure architecture using two levels of security, something known as RSA and DES to ensure security. The preferred strategy for using this is relevant. We advertise a study, interested partners often, or interested parties view a website. If they're interested, they can download and install the app, enter a study code, and fill out an eligibility survey. If they are eligible, they can view a consent video and elect whether or not to consent. And if so, they can opt into the study and follow it along. Often they can access their data as a part of that. And then their data is often cross-linked to other data, weather data, information on the environments in which they're circulating, gained through other sources. Now, where does this data fit in with dynamic modeling? I'm going to be coming to that in the form of the vignette, but I want to give you a glimpse of it. This sort of data provides incredibly valuable data to ground our simulation models. That's not all, but that's a lot of it, to allow us to engage in parameter estimates for these models. It allows us to pin down estimates involving human behavior that weren't in the literature before, that weren't accurately assessed through self-reporting, and allows us to incorporate them into our simulation models. Another feature of it is allows us to build data sets that we can calibrate a model off of. Here, we're not using it to estimate particular parameters in isolation. Rather, we're going to be adjusting aspects of the model so that it best matches its emergent behavior of the model, best matches the empirical data that we're collecting through at high temporal density through our data collection exercises. This further allows us to learn from intervention effects. This is going to be a big point of my talk, that having big data and having models together allow us to much more reliably learn from our interventions, to more reliably learn what worked, what didn't work, so that we can plan more effective interventions going forward. Both of them allow us resolution at the level of particular causal pathways, which have often been difficult to fully understand using traditional measures. And by combining the two, we can more quickly evolve our understanding and more quickly evolve our sense of what intervention features need to be modified for interventions going forward. And finally, it provides a way of combining with these dynamic models so that they incorporate this data, they're regrounded by this data, kept honest by this data on an ongoing basis over time. And that allows us to then use those models going forward with confidence they've incorporated all the data to this point, all the understanding to this point. So I'd like to, this is lofty stuff. I'd like to let's turn to a vignette, a particular case where this is applied, okay? The vignette involves foodborne illness. And I know that for many in the room, you're interested in more upstream issues. And we work a lot with partners interested in social determinants of health, and these tools are very effective here. Foodborne illness and prevention of foodborne illness is a fairly central emphasis of the public health system still. And because it's a small enough study I can present it during this time, I'm going to do so. So our work here involves several components contributed in different areas of literature. One is a dynamic model. This is an agent-based model at a time horizon of several decades. And we had within the model several populations of agents. The model allows us to simulate the evolution of these populations over time. That's why it's a dynamic model. And to do so under different counterfactual policy regimes. We can ask what-if questions with it. In this case, there were three populations: consumers, food vendors, and an inspector, a food inspector. And there was a spatially explicit environment. Just to give you a sense of what's in the model now and what's being added to it, we had some components of individuals seeking food at vendors. Sometimes they were exposed to contaminated food, and this could yield to clinical illnesses or subclinical illnesses, traditionally the real body of the iceberg, that have traditionally gone unnoticed. And the clinical illnesses, some of them get reported to public health. At some point, an outbreak investigation may be undergone. And based on the accuracy of people's recall and the number of people that present for care, there may be progress in the investigation to locate a contaminated facility and shut it down. This contaminated facility may be a restaurant, it might be a food truck, it might be a grocery store selling, contaminated spinach. But it's a locale that's compromised in terms of its food safety. So just to give you a concrete sense of what's involved, this is an example of a representation of states that consumers can be in and movement between those states. So a consumer in this model can be in a healthy state, they can be exposed to illness but not yet symptomatic, and they can progress to a clinical state where they need to seek care, or a subclinical state where they suffer their illness at home, although potentially with absenteeism as a result. And after some period of time, they recover back to a healthy state. Food vendors in this very simple model involved representation of two states. It was dichotomous, a safe state and a contaminated state. And they could move from a safe restaurant to a contaminated restaurant due to endogenous contamination. And they could be cleared of contamination by an inspector's recognizing the problem and return to a safe safe state. Inspectors within this regime alternate between a routine inspection state and outbreak investigation state. Now, a model like this is one of the simplest models that we have out there, but it's simple enough to describe. And I want to emphasize something here. A model like this, even this small, has some big uncertainties associated with it. We have data on, for example, cases reported to public health. We have some data on contaminated vendors that have been found over time. We have some understanding of how clinical illnesses vary in the population. But we have little understanding of many things that are relevant to this model. The accuracy of people's recall, the number of subclinical illnesses, really the body of the iceberg out there. We have little understanding of people's food-seeking patterns across a city as a whole, or their risk perception based on feedback of information on restaurant safety. So in order to inform these aspects of the model, in order to pin it down so we could arrive at a model that was more informative for actual localities, we turned to smartphone-based data collection using our Ethica IEPI system. Our partners in this were the Public Health Agency of Canada. They're very interested in this issue of foodborne illness, one area of them, and they were interested in the potential that novel data sources could provide. So just to give you a sense of this, we outfitted a study this study actually was created in the span of about a day. It's a very straightforward thing to create new studies in this system involving virtually no programming. And in this case, we were collecting information, partnered with the School of Public Health, and we collected a wide variety of types of information that were germane either directly for a research question or indirectly. For example, understanding if the phone was indeed being carried by someone, we needed their accelerometer information. GPS and Wi-Fi for their location to better figure out where they're eating, for example. We also had a variety of surveys that we'll see that they filled out. So in the interface to this app, the individuals, about 100 of them, carried this app, and they could indicate at any time in this sort of crowdsourcing capacity that they were feeling sick, or that when they were eating. And by pressing a button like this, it would call up an articulated survey, which might have some questions that are always asked, some that are conditional with skip patterns, et cetera. So for example, if they indicated that they were feeling ill, we recognized from the start that vast majority of these cases will probably not be foodborne, but we want to ask some basic questions about the symptomology that might make something more plausible or more clearly make it clearly implausible. So we asked about symptomology. We asked if they had consulted a healthcare professional. And then we asked, given that this population included many students, whether there was possibility of alcoholic involvement. Secondly, we asked them to indicate when they were eating. And just to give a sense of adherence to this gives an indication of the number of food records per day recorded by different individuals. So this is a histogram, and for example, for individuals within this is actually a subset of the study, about a third of it or so, or about a half of it. This is 4 individuals fell within about 2.5 to 3 meals per day, or food eating incidents per day. You can see that the vast majority had 1 or more. And once again, when they reported that they were eating, we asked for a couple basic pieces of information to keep the burden small. The source of the food, whether it was something they cooked at home or available through other sources. We asked them to take a photo of it. This photo could then be assessed for whether it was processed food or food that was cooked, et cetera. And then they could explain the nature of that food using either audio or text, and they could do a self-report of that. And in many cases that was filled in, but certainly not all. By providing the audio option, it allowed us a little bit of a lower burden way for people to report it. There were also ecological momentary assessments asked throughout this, and some of these assessments were designed to understand the reliability of their self-reporting. So some of them asked, for example, did you feel sick in the last week? Or did you eat in a restaurant today? To see how much we were missing through these crowdsourced mechanisms. But in other cases, these questionnaires were focused on assessing recall, the degree to which someone could recall reliably what happened 3 days ago or 7 days ago in a way that would be needed during an outbreak investigation. We, of course, had the records of where they ate. We had records through GPS and Wi-Fi, and we had a record from their photos for many of their meals, and we wanted to assess the degree that they could recall them. And so there's a very carefully designed mechanism designed by my colleague Cheryl Waldner to do that. Just to give you a sense of people's compliance, you may think this is very burdensome, and there's no way people would fill this out. This gives a sense of the fraction of survey questions, of questionnaires that were answered by people. And you'll find that the mode of this is up around 95%. So most people answered every single questionnaire minus just a couple. There were quite a number with 100%, and then others varied down to a low of just short of 50%. But in general, we had very good adherence to protocol here. People were willing to share a lot of information. Okay, just to give you a sense of the study, this was actually taken partway through it. But at that time, we had about 60 million records from about half the participants for acceleration alone. GPS data, about 7.5 million records. This is probably from about 50 people for roughly 2/3 of the study. And we had survey responses, about 4,800 at that point in terms of questions. Okay, I'd like now to take a look at how this data ended up coming in informing other data sets. So in order to do this, I'd like to reflect on the fact that our model here involved a rather articulated depiction of this foodborne illness system. So it was simple by the standards of our models, but it involved several different causal pathways. And I noted earlier that we had good information on some of these data points, but we had very limited information on others. And really, these are the ones that we were able to fill in by recourse to big data. Okay. So one of the areas that we really put an emphasis on was in terms of parameter estimation. So trying to understand, for example, what fraction of illnesses yield its clinical versus subclinical illness. This is a classic example of something that we could pick up through records on the smartphone. We can inform how long people reported continuing to stay sick. We can understand something about their food-going behavior, how frequently they were heading out to, for example, food vendors, and to what degree they were going to the same food vendors versus different ones, all yielding important assumptions in this computational model, which we could then use for understanding policy trade-offs. We were also very interested in understanding intervention, the effects of interventions. And one of the interventions we looked at, we can inform this model using measurements from smartphones, but we can also ask about counterfactual intervention regimes. And one of them that we asked about is, what if we provided an app like this so that people could report subclinical symptomology along with the automatic recording of where they've been to public health authorities. And maybe this information will be kept in escrow, but if there's a suspected outbreak, it could be tapped. Or maybe this information will be looked at for evidence of an emergent outbreak, tapping into the subclinical as well as clinical symptomology. And what we found was quite striking here, and I won't go into this. There's too little time to really explicate this fully, but we found that just 4% of the population serving as sentinels, carrying around smartphones which recorded their information about where they've been and then reported subclinical symptoms, could dramatically reduce the occurrence of foodborne illness by allowing cases of contaminated restaurants to be found much more quickly. This was with a data-informed model, one where we put a lot of effort into informing it with good data, and we found a very big effect of even a small segment of the population, in fact, carrying phones that could provide that extra bit of information for public health authorities. Another area, though, that we really emphasized was learning from intervention effects. And you'll recall this idea that I advanced early on about using dynamic models as thinking tools. Dynamic models are not crystal balls. When a dynamic model fails, it is not a sign of a crystal ball that shattered and has failed us. What it's a sign of is an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to learn about how our mental model is off from the actual model. And if we look at models as learning tools, or as my colleague Jeff McDonald says, learning prostheses, tools that help us overcome our limitations to reason purely in our head about very complex systems and allow us to reason instead in a way that can be shared with others, that can be critiqued, refined, and that can be challenged for its consistency with empirical evidence. We recognize that there's opportunities to learn from models when new evidence becomes available. And if we're talking about the types of evidence from smartphones and from big data, the opportunities for learning, for accelerating that learning, are particularly rich. Just to give a sense of this, both our models and these data sources fill in our understanding of many different causal pathways. This is true in the area of foodborne illness, where we have a model that depicts these causal pathways. We have data from smartphones that depict these causal pathways, and we can see the degree to which the models anticipated understanding of what would happen in a particular intervention regime matches what we observe from the smartphones, for example. We can more quickly, in short, arrive at a model that's informed, that's robust, and more worthy of our trust. The same thing is true with that first example I gave on the Moving to Opportunity program. With traditional survey instruments, we know it's very difficult to measure accurately people's dietary intake, their patterns of use of an environment, their mobility. We also know that it's hard to measure physical activity and sedentary behavior with great reliability without a lot of burden. But using these tools of big data, by running apps that record this sort of information, we can clue in to changes across multiple pathways that are in effect when we move people to a mixed income neighborhood. And by looking at which of those pathways have been nudged by the intervention, by this move to a new neighborhood, and which have not been improved, we can actually better understand why an intervention has failed, or why an intervention has showed limited success, and in a way gives us a clue as to how we might do better next time. But equally importantly, we can take measurements along these multiple causal pathways and compare them with what our model expects. After all, our model is an operationalized theory about what's going on out there, and it can help us more quickly refine our model's accuracy, more quickly build a model that captures the external world and can be used for what-if scenarios in a more reliable fashion. Now, I want to highlight, and unfortunately I redacted some of these slides here for presentation, for sharing, and I really need to unredact those, so apologies here. Here's an example of some of the data we get out. This is data that of the sort that is coming out of this study and many other studies, such as ours involving e-cigarette use and cigarette use and their interactions. And what it shows is, for a given participant here, shown up here with 3 different time series, it shows when they reported eating food at home, when they reported eating food in other environments, and when they reported illness. And through biostatistical techniques such as recurrent events analysis, we can explore issues about the degree to which, for example, eating out at certain venues or certain vendors is associated with a greater likelihood of illness, not on the part of just one individual, but on the part of many individuals, because it provides us this detailed level of resolution of particular instances of illness and particular instances of food-seeking behavior. Another component that we can use, however, is drawn not from biostatistics but from machine learning. And this has to do with this notion of hidden Markov models. And hidden Markov models are a technique used in computational statistics, machine learning. They go by several different names. But fundamentally, they involve positing that the system is in one of a set of states over time that are latent, that cannot be directly observed. But within that state, there's certain characteristic signals that are received when you're in that state. For example, if the phone is on person, if it's being carried, you tend to have large amounts of accelerometry measured through this. It tends to be held in certain ways that are unlikely to be purely horizontal, and it's unlikely to be plugged in. If it's off person, it's more likely that it's in a state that might be horizontal or nearly so, has lower acceleration, and it's more likely to be plugged in. And any one of these measurements is unlikely to clue us in with confidence whether we're on person, off person. But if we can use several of them together, often we can triangulate and figure out at a given time, is it on person or off person. Similarly, we've applied these techniques at a public health level. In this case, using data such as would be gathered from smartphones as well as through traditional epidemiological surveillance, we've arrived at hidden Markov models that can classify with greater reliability if an outbreak is likely to be going on within the context of a given municipality, using data garnered on incoming cases of clinical and subclinical illness. And using an understanding from hidden Markov models, we can arrive at, with greater confidence, outbreak detection mechanisms. So I'd like to just comment on some of these synergies which I see before finishing here. Broadly speaking, this electronically sourced data, whether it's admin data, such as in the 45 and up study, or such as we use in Saskatchewan on a population-wide basis, or whether it's data from smartphone-based sensors or from social media, fundamentally this data can ground our simulation models in really rich ways. And it can ground it in a way that takes special advantage of the fact that data is high velocity. It can ground it repeatedly and over time, and allows us to arrive often at much more confident understanding of the human behaviors involved. We can provide databases for dynamic model parameterization and calibration. In other words, some basic validity checks for the model that we might use in a process known as cross-validation of the model. It's data we didn't use in building the model, but the model has to stay consistent with it to be viewed as reliable. And we can use it to stimulate dynamic hypotheses that are then captured within the model in our state charts or in our stocks and flows. We can also use this electronically sensed data because it picks up these changes along particular causal pathways to cross-check the model's anticipation of those results and to correct the model. Models, on the other hand, are critical at multiple different levels. This includes biostatistical models, models at machine learning level, but on a dynamic modeling front, the models are often used to understand the implications of this data, of this big data, for decision making, for choices, for counterfactual situations where we don't have data, but we want to reason about what would happen in this situation. And in this case, these models can serve as ways of projecting forward and asking about what-if questions in a way we couldn't with the data by itself. Now, importantly, these dynamic models, although I didn't have time to go into it, can also be used to govern and shape and inform the choice of sampling rates. One of the things we found, and this is a very important point that I wish I had time to cover, but in certain types of studies, we have found through synthetic knockout experiments, by knocking out sets of data which we have found that if we don't have data measured at a fine temporal resolution, we often come to conclusions that are far off base of what we do when we do have this data. So in other words, this sort of big data, in certain cases, is not merely a luxury, it's not merely a strengthener, but it has to do with having basic validity in the results of the model. In certain cases, for example, for fast-moving infections, if you don't have that data on the level of hourly basis for social network structure, we find we get very different implications from our models. So let me offer a few broad conclusions here from this work. Empirically grounded models require data in order to quantitatively inform trade-offs between policies, in order to understand if one policy is 10% better than another in terms of certain gains. We seek a lot of data, and increasingly this data needs to involve aspects of human behavior. Whether we're dealing with very biomedical situations or dealing with social determinants of health or infectious disease transmission, we're dealing with a realm in which human behavior is often central mediator for the outcomes from interventions. And if we wish to have recommendations from a model that are accurate, we need to know something about that behavior. And unfortunately, that behavior is often poorly captured through traditional survey instruments. Commodity sensor-bearing devices can serve as really dual use as versatile sensor, ecological momentary assessment, and crowdsourcing platform, while still retaining their full value as consumer electronic devices. Through diverse communicational modalities, things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, we can often get extra clues to our context, who's nearby us, where we are inside a building, in ways that wouldn't immediately be obvious. But really, this data by itself is a cacophony of numbers. In order for it to offer value, it needs to be combined with models, and those models are of many sorts. Dynamic models are just part of the toolbox. They're a part of the toolbox that's critical for policy insight, but they need to complement and be complemented by biostatistical models, machine learning models, and basic filtering techniques. Cross-link data of this sorts, cross-linking multiple sorts of data, including self-reporting, with models offers really tremendous potential for informing dynamic modeling. And additional machine learning techniques that I haven't had time to go into, things like particle filtering, can lend us further ability to use these models with rich incoming data sources in a way that's extremely powerful, that keeps the models honest, keeps them updated, and allows us to always look forward with confidence that the models incorporated the latest evidence. But a key use of this sort of big data, a key use of models, in a way in which they fundamentally synergize, is in understanding the effects of interventions. Understanding those effects as they play out across multiple causal pathways, and doing so can give us clues as to how we can act more robustly, more reliably in the context of our interventions, and can more quickly evolve our understanding of the processes operating out there in the world as operationalized by the model. So those are some broad conclusions. I know I whipped through this very quickly, and I thank you for your patience. I want to, again, provide my most sincere acknowledgments for all those who make this event possible, and to the many funders and partners who have contributed in this work, including some of them in this room. And I did want to highlight as one final thing that if anyone's interested in learning more about these things, we are running an event as soon as next week here in Sydney on use of dynamic modeling and health policy that gives a really hands-on guide to building up these sort of models. We also have workshops on using smartphone-based data collection in a boot camp and incubator fashion to build up studies, and two other workshops for people seeking to build models or to understand how they fit into the policy regime. Those are coming up as soon as next week and throughout the summer. So I just highlight those for anyone who's interested in going a bit deeper. And then I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
Hi, Lisa Barrow, Charles Perkins Center. Thank you very much for that very stimulating talk. I want you to say a little bit more about the veracity of the data, because I'm thinking of like old-fashioned data surveillance. You know, people used to collect data on exposure to secondhand smoke, for example.
Yeah.
And the tobacco industry had different exposure estimates than other groups that collected data on secondhand smoke. And so now we can do this through these personal monitors, but often the algorithms are proprietary.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, do you only believe in the veracity of data you can collect yourself, or how can you actually test that when the algorithms are proprietary?
I think this is a very good question, and we've encountered this in significant ways in working with very standard systems like the actographs and so on, where there's a very proprietary algorithm for measuring certain key outcomes. And I think it's a challenge for us as a community that is best confronted with some encouragement from funding agencies and from community norms towards open algorithms, transparency in our calculations. This is something that bioinformatics community learned in a big way in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I was fortunate to be a little bit part of that community then due to some work I was doing. And one of the things we found was a real tension there between certain forces that were keeping methods and metadata and indeed the data itself proprietary and close to the chest, and others often interestingly informed by open source movements from computer science that push towards more open repositories, and in fact certain journals eventually mandating contribution of sequences to open repositories. And I think the time is at hand where we need to think beyond putting data in open repositories, invoking open source principles there, but also for the algorithms used to analyze that data. And I don't think that this is per se a strength or shortcoming of big data, but I think in the big data context, in as much as we're putting more emphasis on this data to inform our theory building, it's particularly urgent. And I think if we can shape it early in the evolution of that community, just like in bioinformatics it happened, we might be able to move towards a context where the proprietary standards are increasingly seen as non-viable, and what's needed for credibility in publication, for securing funding, for being regarded as making a real contribution is use of open, documented, transparent algorithms. I really think this is needed, and I think this is as much a matter of community norms as it is standard setting, but I do think that funding agencies in journals and other influential parties can help encourage those moves. And I'm fortunate to say that within the NIH, I know, an area where I circulate quite a lot, there's a lot of interest in that. And I would note that carries over to models, to these sort of dynamic models, because once again, we are dealing with situations where recommendations are made for models that are often incompletely described, not to the point of being able to be reproduced. And increasingly, those at the NIH and elsewhere, as part of Standards Task Force, which I'm a steering member of, are looking for ways to mandate open repositories of models, so that if you're drawing your recommendations from a model, it needs to be open for review, critique, and extension and refinement. And that's how the bioinformatics community overcame a lot of real risks early on by commitment to those open standards, and I think it's long overdue within the context of health. I hope those are useful comments.
Hi, Alex Gioni from the Behavioral Insights Unit. I was really impressed by Ethica, and I'm going to go download it after this talk. However, I know that I'm quite atypical. I've got Wi-Fi, atypical.
Okay.
To be polite.
Yeah.
I've got Wi-Fi scales, got my smartwatch. Oh. I really don't care about my own data privacy to the point where my partner and I can track each other's real-time location.
Right.
And I suspect that I'm probably more similar to the people in the study than the people that we design healthcare policy for.
Yeah.
And I just want to think about ask you rather, how do we make sure that the findings that we have are ecologically valid,
yes,
particularly when we're dealing with quite vulnerable populations?
I think this is a great question, and you'll sometimes hear glib statements on this issue of validity. I've heard it claimed that the volume of the data, even if it's on a small number of non-representative people, the volume of the data is such that you don't have to worry about traditional sample sizes and representativeness for people. The data speaks for itself. I think that's nonsense. I think that it is just as incumbent upon us, and maybe more so in the short term, to really insist upon very careful reasoning about representativeness, about sample sizes needed to make sure that we speak to the diversity of populations, and techniques such as weighting and others that help us make sure that despite recruitment limitations, we might be able to generalize the findings some. I think there's a lot that needs to be going on there. I will say that in our methods, we have made use of respondent-driven sampling, for example, to try to recruit social networks while still getting some measure of representativeness. We have sought population-wide involvement of individuals in a way that takes into account the demographics of those individuals and really works extra hard at recruitment in vulnerable communities. I think that there's the barriers there are a bit different than many people perceive. We've worked with many studies, from New York City housing projects to our work with some low-income rural populations to work with low-income groups in Boston and shortly in Houston area, where a lot of traditional fears about interest and willingness to participate on the part of lower income individuals have not shown to be actually to hold up. So in other words, while many have feared that smartphones are a rarity and cannot be widely used among low SES groups, if you actually look at the latest evidence, among some low SES groups, people are reporting that communications technology ranks up there with food and shelter up there in priorities for them. And they depend so heavily on their social networks. So that phone is really valuable. And we are finding cases where we have offered phones to individuals in low-income communities and they've turned it down, saying, no, their current phone is better, thank you very much. It may surprise, but we have found other cases where there are issues, where, for example, one study deployment going on right now in Lawrence, Massachusetts, is running into issues because of extra software we need to install to understand browsing, health-related browsing behavior, and we're finding that a lot of the participants have eligible phones, but they have little in the way of storage space, and we cannot afford to turn them away. We need to put in the extra work to make them eligible, and that includes sometimes giving out phones for individuals. Being prepared to supplement data plans is another thing that we've done to make sure that we bring in vulnerable groups. I will say, though, that the challenges there are different than we thought. We have noticed that in lower income groups there is a greater awareness and perhaps distrust is too strong a word, wariness of certain types of data being collected, and we've had to overcome some of those trust barriers, which when people feel that removed from a formal healthcare system, they don't understand, doesn't speak their language, etc. There's sometimes trust barriers that have to be overcome there. So I think there's a lot of hard work that has to be done there with classic EPI principles for recruitment and so on that doesn't change. But the barriers are different than you might think, based on obvious sort of socioeconomic gradients in terms of affordability. There's a lot of potential for use of these technologies in lower income groups. I will tell you one other vignette, though, about this, and I'll be short. One of the reasons that some of our partners are turning to us so heavily for the Ethica system is because their traditional methods of population surveillance are breaking down. Their traditional use of large-scale random digit dialing for their province to talk about representativeness, it's grossly unrepresentative. They're getting mostly retirees at home, some of whom want to talk for the interview or over the phone, and so they're realizing that their current techniques aren't really the status quo is not an option alone. They need to supplement it with other techniques, and there's no question that we are reaching different types of people in that population, including youth and including some individuals in rural areas that may be difficult to recruit through traditional random digit dialing or door-to-door surveys. So I think there's a lot to be learned there, and I agree with you, it's hard work and it's important work, and we need to leverage the knowledge that's been built up in EPI, the good principles of study recruitment don't go away.
Jean-Frédéric Lévesque from the Bureau of Health Information. Thank you for a great talk and for helping me to better understand something that is quite complex, but also sometimes hidden behind those buzzwords that you talked about. So thank you for taking the time. My question relates to other levels of information that you might want to add in the model, such as ecological exposures that really are not individual exposures at all, organizational factors that might influence everybody at the same time for whatever reason. Are there any developments there? Not trying to make all of the complexity even more complex, but really trying to capture also those more societal or environmental exposure in those dynamic models.
Right. I'm grateful for that question. There are a number of models out there in the health sphere that seek to take into account broader impacts across the population of a model, not limited to one individual in their situated context, but perhaps linked to regulatory policy regimes, linked to availability of mass media would be another one, sort of broad exposure, or messaging from central authorities. And this is one area we've worked a lot with our models involving risk perception associated with vector-borne disease. So we happen to be a province hard hit, and likely going forward, because of global warming, even harder hit by the scourge known as West Nile virus in North America. And within the context of our province, there's a lot of effort put into messaging to try to warn people, every year to exercise protective behaviors, to not go outside and during dawn and dusk, and to put on better clothing. And we built models that try to take that into account, and used, in fact, point of sale data on certain types of protective products to look to the degree to which people are responding to those messaging campaigns. Another aspect of big data that wasn't in my vignette here, but is very important, to what degree are people actually going out and purchasing protective, mosquito repellent, et cetera. We also have combined that with use on Ethica for a system to allow people to have data recorded, which might clue us into how often are people going out in dawn and dusk. We can distinguish using Hayden Markov models between indoor-outdoor environments, and so we can ask, how often are people outdoors and exposed potentially at dawn and dusk. We can look at where they're circulating and how that compares to mosquito estimates for that regions. We can cross-link it with weather data and ask, how does high temperatures lead to personal protective behaviors that differ as reported through ecological momentary assessment, or as reported through the smartphones in other ways. And this is very powerful, because a lot of these responses to advisories and to policy-shaped efforts on the part of the government, they've been really uncertain how much those really make a difference in terms of personal protective and risk behaviors. And through a combination of these, we can actually take our models, which already try to incorporate those features, and with point of sale data and data collected via phones, we can get much better and more confident understandings of the human theater that's so important for protecting people from vector-borne illness. I hope those are useful comments, but glad to dialogue more about that.
We do have a request for one last very quick question.
I can try.
Well, otherwise I'm thinking it's 6:30. Okay, so right off you go. We've got a few minutes while they're setting up. Okay.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Nate, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. My name is Fabian Held. I'm from the Charles Perkins Center here at the University of Sydney. And the short question is, how clear are the answers that we can hope for from these methods? The long question, well, the explanation of this question is, as you said, they're very complex models, many different dimensions that are relevant, many different causal pathways. So at the end, we'll get they're always stochastic as well.
Yes.
So we'll get a distribution of possible outcomes.
That's right.
For every tweak that we do with the model, every parameter setting, every kind of variation on the intervention that we look at.
Right.
In your experience, are there always clear-cut answers, or can we maybe only hope for a little shift in tendencies where we don't even know if there's a statistical difference in outcomes?
so it's a deep question, and in respect for the audience, I'm going to keep my answer shorter. And perhaps it's only fitting that in front of a mural such as this one that I quote the late Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill once remarked that democracy is the worst of all forms of government except for everything else. And a glib answer would be, for many questions, I do feel that dynamic modeling is filled with challenges, difficulties, shortcomings, but it may be the best of all options I know except for everything else. And the big data side has the potential for much informing it and helping us to get rid of some of the blind spots in the models. But fundamentally, as I said, I'm a disbeliever, I'm a skeptic modeler, and I view models as crystal balls as entirely fallible. If you put your trust fully in this model that it represents reality, you're setting yourself up for a bruising. Rather, I see them fruitfully as ways of taking something that's going on anyway in our heads. We have theories about what's going on out there. The problem is, if they're trapped in our heads, we can't share them with others. We can't critique them collectively. We can't refine them. I can't build on top of yours because I don't have a full understanding of your theory. At least with models, we're putting them out there in the public domain, and public is important, related to that previous question I answered, in a way that can be documented, critiqued, refined over time, but most importantly, tested against the clear light of day in terms of empirical evidence, tested against the observations, qualitative and quantitative, of those who are part of the system, and thereby they can be falsified more quickly so we can advance them. They're always going to be flawed, just like our understanding of the world is going to be flawed, but if we can at least put ourselves in a road to faster learning, to learning more deeply, more thoroughly, and more reliably from evidence using these models, we'll do a lot better than if they're trapped purely in our heads, or if they're trapped purely in prose. So, Francis Bacon once said, Jeff had this delightful quote that he brought to my attention. It is easier to evolve truth from error than from confusion. And that sounds outrageous. How can you evolve truth from error? It's better to be confused. Well, the point was fail early, fail often, right? He could have had Shakespeare refine it for him a bit. Maybe he was Shakespeare. Well, anyway, but the point is that he was basically saying, look, if you're going to try something and you discover that there's a problem, then you've at least gotten somewhere, right? And I think models are much of them that way. I am very much of the opinion that we have to be cautious with our interpretation, and they are one tool in a rich toolbox. And they have to be cross-checked and interrogated with data to improve them over time, and cross-checked with understanding other than data, observations from people. But often it's not until you build a model that you can elicit some of that understanding. It's not until someone in the team looks at that and says, oh, that's very different from what I've seen on a day-to-day basis. That's when those understandings come out, when they're looking at something and interacting with it. And so I think having a transparent model and one that's used on an ongoing basis is really a tool for faster learning. It's not a tool for predicting with perfect accuracy, and we need to be very cautious about our confidence that we put into it, and it's incumbent upon us as modelers to couch our recommendations in a way that reflects that tentativeness and the limitations. And there are models of very different sorts that have very different scales of limitations, and we need to, as part of sort of basic ethics, communicate those limitations to parties. There are statistical ways that we can test significance given stochastic reliability. I won't go into those now, but non-parametric statistical tests that we use routinely with models, et cetera. And I'd be glad to have a conversation about those separately. But that's a poor answer to your question, but I hope it's a bit helpful. Okay.